The Cold War. This documentary is intended to describe the history and significant events of what has been known as the Cold War. The Cold War was an industrial, intellectual, and legislative confrontation between the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the Soviet Union. Capitalism, an economic system in which investment and ownership is achieved by private individuals. Communism, a system of social organization in which all economic activity is controlled by the government. The first person to use the term Cold War was George Orwell in October of 1945. After World War II, Germany was divided amongst the four great Allied powers. The Northwest went to France, the Midwest went to Great Britain, the Southwest went to America, and the East went to the Soviet Union. On June 24, 1948, the Soviet Union closed all entrances to Berlin, Germany. This would later be known as the Berlin Blockade. In response to the Berlin blockade, the U.S. and Great Britain airlifted supplies to the people stranded outside of Berlin. To help end the blockade and the widespread of communism altogether, U.S. President Harry Truman announced his doctrine. He said that any countries willing to resist communism would receive U.S. aid. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin wished to spread communism to the world. He believed with total communism the world would be at peace. The first place Stalin went to gain communism support was Asia. He convinced people that communism would one day rule the world. Communist Chinese forces under Mao Zedong overthrew the nationalist government and set up the People's Republic of China. On June 25, 1950, North Korean Communist forces invaded South Korea, starting the Korean War. North Korea was backed by the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. South Korea was backed by the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. On July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed to end the war, but to this day, communism remains a threat in North Korea. There was no real date or event that started the Vietnam War. However, most people signify the rise of Ho Chi Minh as the beginning. U.S. involvement in the war began in 1965 when 200,000 combat troops arrived in Vietnam. By 1967, there were 500,000 U.S. military personnel in Vietnam. The Communist forces proved to be too much for U.S. military personnel. This led to many casualties and a public opposition of the war.
Thousands of demonstrators opposed to the Vietnam War assembled in the nation's capital for a mass protest. For the most part orderly, minor scuffles did occur between the demonstrators and hecklers.
On August 13, 1961, construction of the Berlin Wall began. This wall was created by communist-ruled East Germany to keep citizens from fleeing the democratic West Germany. This wall was manned 24/7 by East Germany guards. In 1959, Fidel Castro led the Cuban Revolution and overthrew the democratic government and set up a communist state. He quickly made relations with the Soviet Union in an attempt to bring down the U.S. After learning of this, U.S. President John F. Kennedy worked with U.S. military personnel and Cuban refugees to invade the Bay of Pigs where Castro's headquarters were. Somehow, the Cubans found out about this plan early and launched a counterattack, capturing over 1,000 people. This failed military operation led to a world humiliation of the United States. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 spy plane spotted missile sites being constructed in Cuba. President John F. Kennedy talked about the crisis with his cabinet, along with his brother and Attorney General Robert Kennedy. On October 22, 1962, President Kennedy ordered a naval blockade on Cuba, preventing Soviet ships from delivering more missiles. That night, Kennedy went on TV and told the nation of the crisis.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
On October 27, 1962, President Kennedy received a letter from Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev proposing a trade. The Soviets will remove the missiles from Cuba if the U.S. removes their not-so-secret missiles from Turkey. On November 22, 1963, while President Kennedy was on a campaign rally in Dallas, Texas, a man shot and killed him. The assassination was found to be an internal terrorist attack and had nothing to do with the Soviet Union. After the crisis of October 1962, the Cold War seemed to cool down. When Richard Nixon became president in 1969, he tried to end the long-lasting Vietnam War. This proved to be a mistake because the communist forces were still strong. Eventually, Nixon was forced to withdraw all U.S. troops, and North Vietnam won the war. On October 23, 1974, the International Olympic Committee voted to have the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow, Soviet Union. President Gerald Ford, along with many other leaders, decided their countries were boycotting the Games for safety and security. On September 1, 1983, a Soviet tank shot down civilian Flight 007 of Korean Airlines. The shooter claimed it looked like a spy plane. In all, 269 people died when the plane crashed. In March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in the Soviet Union. He spoke out a lot about ending the war peacefully. President Ronald Reagan worked hard with Gorbachev to end the war peacefully. On June 12, 1987, Reagan made his final push to end the war.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
On October 3, 1990, after the Berlin Wall was torn down, Germany was reunited into one free country. In 1991, the Soviet Union slowly but finally collapsed. On December 24, 1991, U.S. President George H.W. Bush received a phone call from Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin asked that the Russian Federation is recognized as a socialist state. He officially declared the end of the Cold War. After 3 long decades of fighting, the war was finally over. The Cold War is considered a turning point in history because it changed government practices in several countries and had a significant impact on foreign relations. Until this day, communism sits on the threat of extinction.